evening. Welcome to the Glazov gang. Tonight, the truth about the Cuban embargo. We have a very special guest with us, Humberto Fontova, the author of 4 books, including his latest, The Longest Romance, The Mainstream Media and Fidel Castro. Humberto Fontova, what an honor and a privilege to have you on the Glazov gang.
Thanks a lot, buddy. Man, I've been dying to get on here, and thanks a lot for the invitation. It's great to be here.
This is kind of the peak of your life and your career to be on the Glazov gang.
Pretty close to it, amigo. Pretty close.
Okay, well, we finally did it. Let's begin with this, Humberto. There's so many people in the media, everybody, oh, the Cuban embargo's coming to an end. Obama's ushering in this beautiful time of peace and reconciliation. Right. But what is the truth about what Obama's doing instead, in terms of ending this embargo?
Yeah, first of all, the president cannot end the so-called embargo. First of all, it's not an embargo because the United States, for the last decade or so, has been one of Cuba's top 5 trading partners. Do you know that we've been among Cuba's top food suppliers for the last 10 years? The only thing the so-called embargo stipulates since 2000 is that Castro pay cash up front, baby, for anything he wants to buy from the U.S. in the form of medical goods and agriculture. And that has been enormously beneficial to the U.S. taxpayer because Castro has stuck it to every single nation and entity that has extended him credit. And so when people say the embargo hasn't worked, I have to laugh. I say the embargo has worked like a charm in protecting the U.S. taxpayer from getting rooked by Castro. But he can't lift that by himself. Congress has to vote on it. The so-called embargo, which are really just a few sanctions, were codified into U.S. law in 1996. Granted, a lot of people wonder nowadays what the U.S. Constitution counts for with this administration. But so far, he has not been able to lift most of the embargo.
Humberto, also in terms of the embargo, it's incredible the myths out there. Whatever this embargo is, and as you say, is it really quote-unquote embargo? But even when people say, oh, well, even Obama was saying, well, what we've been doing hasn't worked. What exactly was the objective of the quote-unquote embargo in the first place? Was it really regime change?
No, in fact, it was not regime change. In fact, I quoted in my book Secretary of State Dean Rusk in 1962 when he went down to the Organization of American States who were holding a meeting in Uruguay. And he was urging the rest of Latin America to join the United States in the sanctions against Cuba. He went out of his way to say, we do not have a quarrel with Castro's internal politics. What they were trying to do is contain his sponsorship of terrorism. This is 1962, folks, and he was already arming and succoring and training guerrillas to spread Soviet communism throughout Latin America. That's what the embargo was meant to contain, and it did work like a charm in that respect.
Okay, Humberto, in terms of what Obama's doing now, in terms of quote-unquote ending this embargo and, improving relations or whatever it is that Obama says this is going to do or that he's trying to do, why are you concerned? How could this be harmful? And there are those that would say, hey, well, this might lead to the collapse of the Cuban regime. Let's give it a try. Why do you think it's harmful what he's doing?
Well, because there's nothing in it for us, Jamie. Let's face it. What me and you and our viewers have got to ask ourselves, what is in it for the United States of America and for the Cuban people? Cuba's dissident movement, almost en masse, with the exception of 1 or 2, are against what Obama's doing. And yet he claims to be doing this on behalf of the Cuban people. Yet the Cuban people, best we can tell, and let's face it, it's hard to, it's hard to conduct a poll in a Stalinist country, but best we can tell, they're overwhelmingly against what he is doing. So the Cuban people are out of it, and the U.S. taxpayer, as I mentioned, is being protected by the sanctions against Cuba, plus international terrorism is being contained by the so-called embargo. So there is absolutely nothing in it for U.S. interests.
Okay, just a sec, Humberto. There is the argument in some ways, like let's say with the Soviet Union when glasnost was ushered in, when you have an improvement of relations, and let's even say that the totalitarian regime relies on this myth of the aggressive enemy and we need to have this order. Is there a chance that this accommodation, that this improvement of relations leads to a certain thaw that in the end undermines the Castro regime?
If there was a Gorbachev or a Deng Xiaoping or even a Khrushchev running Cuba, but there is nothing remotely of the sort running Cuba. The Castro brothers are more akin to Stalin, Mao, and the Kim family in North Korea than they are to Gorbachev. That's what I always tell people, folks. It's not Alexander Dubček or Tito running Cuba. It's Stalin. We have got 20 years of evidence, 20 years of massive tourism to Cuba, 20 years of European and Canadian and Japanese, everything, investment into Cuba. And absolutely nothing has changed. The Heritage Foundation just came out with their Index of Economic Freedom worldwide. Cuba is exactly where it's been for the last 20 years, dead last next to North Korea. And that's with 20 years of 2 to 3 million tourists visiting Cuba and massive foreign investment. So it's not just that the evidence is in, the proof is in.
Thank you, Humberto. In other words, could it be legitimately said that what Obama's doing is actually coming to the rescue of a fascist totalitarian dictator?
Exactly, and is doing it just at the right time, right at the time that Venezuela, which, as you know, became their sugar daddy after the Soviet Union collapse. Venezuela started up, as a matter of fact, the subsidies they received from Venezuela for the last 10 years or so were actually over and above what they used to get from the Soviet Union. Well, the price of oil is dipping, Venezuela is crumbling, and boom, Obama stepped in just in the nick of time. Here I come to save the day, Castro. And that's what really upsets so many Cuba watchers.
Humberto, before we move to some other issues that I want to discuss connected to this, let's stop for a moment to reflect and ponder the suffering of the Cuban people. And tell us about the atrocious human rights record and about this fascist monster and his monstrous regime that rules over Cuba, and his supporters and all his admirers in the West should be ashamed of themselves.
In a nutshell, the Cuban regime, the same people running Cuba today, jail political prisoners at a higher rate than did Stalin during the Great Terror. They murdered more political prisoners in their first 3 years in power than Hitler's regime murdered in its first 6 years in power. And they converted a nation that in 1958 had a higher standard of living than half of Europe, mostly Southern Europe, into a place that rivals Haiti in poverty and has the highest suicide rate in the hemisphere. For heaven's sakes, folks. And a lot of people say, well, Humberto, that's ancient history. Let's move on. Let's change. Folks, it is the exact same people running Cuba right now as ran it and caused the conditions that I just mentioned to you, JB. It's the same people. I tell people, was Adolf Eichmann or Klaus Barbie a threat to anyone when they were rounded up in South America and brought to justice? Of course not. But there was a sense of justice that they had to be brought to justice. The Castro brothers did all these things, and they're sitting there, and now they're enjoying financial largesse from the United States. There's something wrong with that, Jamie.
Humberto, there's also something wrong, I would say, in our media. I don't see you in our, you should be invited constantly on every media channel.
Thank you.
And, you're ostracized, you're marginalized, and trust me, my brother, I know the feeling of being marginalized. But tell me a few of your experiences, even when you were invited on. A few curious things happened on a show or two. What happened, my brother?
Well, really, it was only a couple of weeks ago, John Stossel, whom I agree with most of his stuff, was good enough to invite me on a show where we were going to discuss the very Cuban embargo. And he had another person, a Cato Institute scholar on there. And so they were going to gang up on me. It was going to be me against them. But I said I'd be happy to do it with half my brain tied behind my back, buddies. So I went on and I was explaining to him, I said, you guys are in favor of the U.S. taxpayer. You're against totalitarianism. We should be on the same page on this thing, guys. We really should be. And then I started mentioning to him, you Cato Institute guys, you base your anti-embargo position on a Defense Department report from 1998 that said Cuba is no threat to the United States. In fact, it's no threat to any nation in the hemisphere. And they nodded. They said, yeah, that's right. So that's what. And I said, well, do you guys know that the author of that report is Ana Belén Montes, who is suffering 25 years of prison in a maximum security prison in the U.S. as we sit in this room because she was convicted of the same crimes as the Rosenbergs. And boom, they gaped. And don't you know that that portion of the show was completely cut out because it was so embarrassing to their position. In other words, they're basing their whole Cuba is not a threat on a report authored by a convicted Stalinist spy. That was so embarrassing, they had to cut it out of the show completely.
Goodness gracious. Humberto Fontova, why the complicity of major U.S. media players in spreading Castro's propaganda?
Well, it's a goal. It's been a target of the Castro regime since day one. Since they were before they were even in power, when they were in the hills, Castro said, propaganda is the heart of our struggle. And Che Guevara, in his diaries that he was writing in 1958, he said, more important than guerrilla recruits for our army were U.S. media recruits to spread our propaganda. So it's been a target of his. But you see, they were the cool guys. See, they were the first beatniks. Everybody asked me that. Well, what is this romance with the Castro regime? Look at him. Look at him in 1959. Look at Fidel Castro. He looks kind of like Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead. Raul Castro had a blonde ponytail and shoulder-length blonde hair. Man, he looked like Joe Walsh of the Eagles, right? And of course, Che Guevara looked like Jim Morrison of the Doors. So it's this whole notion. In 1959, April of 59, Castro came to the United States, Fidel, and he spoke at Harvard University on the same bill as the beatnik poet Allen Ginsberg. And it seemed perfectly congruous. Hey, they're both beatniks. So this aura of these are cool guys still lives. The fact that they're Stalinists has not penetrated the media and the celebrity culture.
So, but it's so interesting, Humberto, that, all these cool, hippies and media people and rock and roll people or whatever, the hip hop people and the arts people love Castro.
Right.
And I mean, he persecutes these people.
Yeah, I mean, look what I'm wearing, Jamie. I'm wearing a T-shirt with Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones on it, man. Isn't that cool? Is that cool or what?
That's very. You're the coolest guy I know. And what's the meaning? What's the meaning?
The meaning is that Castro regime, it is the only regime in the modern history of the hemisphere that criminalized rock music. So you've got Carlos Santana wearing a Che Guevara T-shirt. You've got Rage Against the Machine wearing Che Guevara T-shirts. You've got a lot of people. You've got a lot of rock and rollers, Woodstock people, penning hymns to the Cuban regime, and yet they're the only regime who outlawed their very music. Carlos Santana was sitting there at the Oscars in 2005 showing off his Che Guevara T-shirt. I'm so cool, I'm so hip. Carlos Santana, most people that knew that, was showing off the emblem of a regime that made it a criminal offense to listen to Carlos Santana music.
Incredible.
You've got to develop a sense of humor about this stuff, Jamie, to remain sane.
Humberto, not to minimize or trivialize this discussion in any way when I say this, but I think one of your professions could have been a great actor. Because I see, you could have played a great role, maybe in a great movie. You're very charismatic, and did you ever think of acting in a film? I mean, you're a character. No?
Funny you should mention that, Jamie, because as we speak right now, a reality TV show titled Humberto's Fontova's Revenge.
Now you're
the
talking.
Pilot has been filmed and it is being peddled to the networks as we speak.
Now you're talking. Your real career is coming up. But look, I wish you all the best in that. But look, you've been such a brave freedom fighter and fighter on behalf of the Cuban people. We've just got a minute left. What's your message to the American public, to the West, what they should keep in mind about the quote-unquote embargo and how Obama is supposedly putting it to an end?
That's great. I mean, thanks a lot. I mean, the point is there is no embargo. What sanctions exist have helped the U.S. taxpayer and the American people, and now they are being taken away, supposedly on behalf of the Cuban people, and they're saying, no, we don't want this. But of course, their version is not being reported in the U.S. media. And that's why it's so nice to have you guys getting the truth out.
But especially me, right?
Exactly. I mean, it's not like we have a lot of friends in the media, Jamie.
Right.
It's great to have you,
Right, right. It's just my sense of humor. Humberto, look, I really want to thank you on a personal level, too, because, when many years back when I was a kid, I read Against All Hope by Armando Valadares. And that memoir remained in my heart and in my soul every day till this day. I keep him in my mind. I keep the suffering people in my mind in Cuba. Thank you so much for standing up for the Cuban people under that atrocious regime.
Thank you, Jamie. Anytime, amigo. You got my number, baby.
Okay. And when you become a big TV star, please get me involved, okay? Okay, don't forget about the little guys when you become. Don't forget the little guys when you become a big TV star. We'll see you next week on the Glazov Game. Good night.